Good morning. Shabbat Shalom. Hope everybody's doing well. I'm glad that everybody made it out today in some not so pleasant weather at times. But remember that the rains bring forth life. The water is what allows life to come forth. So I always try to encourage myself that when it's a dreary day and it's rainy and not so pleasant. So glad to be here today. We have somewhat of a light crew. We've got some people traveling, but we also have visitors today, so please make sure you make our visitors welcome and feel at home. I was thinking about a story this week where there was a soldier back, or not a soldier yet, but a person back in the mid-19th century when the Civil War was kicking off, and he was not well with himself. He had families on both sides of the conflict, and he was struggling with the principles of both sides of the conflict, and he was not sure what he should do. Either way he went, he was going to have to compromise some piece of him in order to be involved in the situation. He did come to a compromise. He decided that he would wear the jacket of the North and the pants of the South, and he was shot by both sides. Compromise can be a funny thing, right? What is compromise? It's a settlement of differences by mutual concessions, an agreement reached by adjustment of conflicting or opposing claims or principles by modifications on demands. One of the best ways that we can see and understand and even talk about compromises is through our marriages. And early on, when my wife and I got married, we decided that we would both take part in making decisions in our marriage. She would make decisions for small things, and I would make decisions for large things. Today, we still haven't had any large decisions, but we came to that conclusion. She told me last year she wanted to go on a vacation. And I said, I'd really prefer, I'm tired from work and everything, I'd rather have a staycation. And what ensued was an altercation. All right, enough dad jokes. Compromise is an interesting thing. Sometimes it can be good, except for when it comes to our relationship with God. The book of Daniel offers an interesting perspective on compromise. It begs the reader to ask the question, do they compromise at times and not others? Or is compromise unfailing or unwilling on the parts of these hero stories? Daniel is a book that a lot of people don't quite understand sometimes. It's the most referenced book in the book of Revelation, so we have a lot of understanding of prophecy from the book of Daniel, but even in itself, we don't know exactly how to place it within our scriptures because only half of it is really prophecy. Out of the 12 chapters, the first 6 are these hero stories, these stories of these people that are working in the midst of the place where they found themselves. But a little bit of background to the book of Daniel, this story starts, not necessarily when it was written, but the story of Daniel starts right as Babylon is taking the people of Israel and Judea into captivity. It starts with a situation where they're taking the rulers and the elite people. If we could put it in modern terms, Babylon was capturing the one percenters. Sometimes we think of the captivities of Assyria and Babylon as being kind of one note and one event, but especially when it came to the Babylonian captivity, they actually had 3 waves of captivity. The big one, where they took most of everybody to Babylon, was in 587, 586, but there was one before that, 597, where they came in and took the one percenters. They left a king on the throne, but they took everybody else that had money and power in Jerusalem. And this is where we find the people of Daniel and his friends. This is where we find them in the story. Just before this, they've had great reforms, somewhat. Josiah, a great king, had the path that it was supposed to be on, but his grasp for power would be his demise. He would be killed by Necho in the place of Megiddo in the north. And if you want a message on that, coincidentally, my friend Matthew Vanderell is giving a message on that today. You can go watch it online. But Necho placed Jehoiakim on the throne, and when Babylon came to fight Egypt, they left Jehoiakim there, and they went to fight Egypt, and they were defeated. And what ensued was really a mockery. The people of Judea mocked Babylon. You came all this way to defeat Egypt, and you couldn't do it. It was this mockery that led to, or in part, that led to the captivity of Israel into Babylon. So in 597, they take the elite, and this is where we're going to be today. If you have your Bibles, we're going to be in Daniel chapter 1, and we'll just read through it. We're going to discuss it. We're going to see what it has for us today. So in Daniel chapter 1, it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and laid siege on it. The Lord handed King Jehoiakim of Judah over to him, along with some of the vessels from the house of God. Nebuchadnezzar carried them to the land of Babylon, to the house of his God, and put the vessels of the treasury of his God." Here we have Nebuchadnezzar. He's really not the king of Babylon. He's really the crown prince. His name means the eldest son of Nabopolassar, Nabopolassar being a great ruler of Babylon. His name in Akkadian really is more like Nabu Kaduri Ushur, which means Nabu protects the eldest son. His name was calling on protection for him, the eldest son of his father. But if we look in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, we see his name is actually Nebuchadrezzar. Anybody ever had any questions of that? Why his name was Nebuchadrezzar in some prophecies and Nebuchadnezzar in another? Bill raised his hand. I'm not saying I have the answer, but it seems to be that in most of the biblical texts, whenever it mentions Babylonian gods or Babylonian kings, it actually corrupts their name on purpose. We do similar things in our literature today and throughout the world. We make a mockery of things that we think are below us. So in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, they call him Nebuchadrezzar, which actually means Nabu protects the donkey. It's actually calling the crown prince of Assyria a donkey. This is actually a known slur in the ancient world because Nebuchadnezzar's father was married to a Median prince. And Herodian tells us that the offspring of mixed relations in royalty were referred to as donkeys. But what do we have here in the first couple of verses? We have two powers: Nebuchadnezzar, the crown prince of Babylon, and Adonai, the God of Israel. It says here that Nebuchadnezzar took these things and placed them in his house and in his place, but it's Yahweh who is in control. He is the one who gave the people and the vessels to Babylon when the people sinned too much. He is the one who allowed Babylon to come in and even have access. We need to keep that in mind as we go through the story, that it's God who is in control. And then we get into this story, the main story of Daniel and his friends. In verse 3, it says, "The king ordered Ashpenaz," and Ashpenaz is likely a title, not necessarily his name. Mine says the chief eunuch. Again, these are some translational issues, but I'll call him the palace master. This is kind of like the right-hand man to Nebuchadnezzar. The king ordered Ashpenaz, his palace master, to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and from nobility. Here we have the indication that this is speaking to the first deportation of the 1%ers. Young men without any physical defect, good-looking, suitable for instruction in all wisdom, knowledgeable, perceptive, and capable of serving the king's palace. These are not older men like, I'm not going to name any names today, sitting in the back room with his arms crossed. These are younger men like Elijah in the back, right? These are teenagers. These are young men who are fit. They're smart. These are the people who are the class presidents of their senior class. These are the young men who are part of all things sports and everything else. These are who they're seeking out. They're not seeking out Matt Nappier. They're not seeking out Will Ham or Layman Tucker. Why? Why are they not seeking out the older people? One, they're not physically fit. Layman would beg to differ. And two, they're not so easily manipulated. Let's be honest, the most easily manipulated people in society are teenagers. They're the most easily influenced. And if you haven't understood that yet, I hope you do, that just one single word or sentence of encouragement that you could give to a teenager can change their life forever. Adversely, one harsh word or word of discouragement could also change their life forever. This is why the king wanted these young strapping men. And continuing on in verse 5, the king assigned them daily provisions from the royal food and from wine that he drank. They were to be trained for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to attend the king. Among them, from the Judahites, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief eunuch, or the palace master, gave them new names. He gave them the name Belteshazzar to Daniel, Shadrach to Hananiah, Meshach to Mishael, and Abednego to Azariah. Here in these verses, we have these young men. They're plucked up from their home. These are men, these young, strapping young boys, these teenage boys. They're coming from Jerusalem and being placed in Babylon. They're coming from a place where they can see and hear God every single day. They lived in a unique period of time where the word of the Lord was going out exponentially through its prophets in Judea and the surrounding areas, but it was being done so because the people weren't living as they should. But these impressionable young men, they can see the temple. They have the ears to hear the worship that goes on every single day. They hear the prophets speaking the words of Yahweh to the people, and then they're brought to a place where they're surrounded with pagan worship and a pagan lifestyle. They're surrounded in a place that's completely influenced by the power of men of the nation instead of the power of Yahweh. They're brought to a place where they can be so easily influenced by the world. It's easy to be godly around godly people, right? It's not so easy to be godly around people who aren't. And this is why fellowship is so important. This is why weekly fellowship is so important. That's why we started having a midweek service, because some people need that extra fellowship to help them. We all need it at times to help us stay firm. It's dangerous to be away from godly people in the midst of the ungodly. Doesn't mean that it's a sin to do so. Obviously, Daniel and his friends weren't there on their own accord, but it's nice to, or it's wise to understand, like 1 Corinthians 15 says, that we're not to be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. And I bring all this up because here they've come from a place where they should have been surrounded by great theological messages of morality from God himself. They should have been in the midst of a people who were training them up in the way to live according to Yahweh's ways, but they're brought to a place where that's completely absent. They're brought to a place where it would be so hard for them to stand firm and so easily compromised in the midst of such a world. They're not only brought to a new place, and think about it yourself. Anybody ever moved from, a lot of people here live their whole lives. Even just moving from one place to another can be tough. Even going from one place to another for a long period of time, even if you're still calling this place home, can be really tough. Because home, no matter where that is, can be a place of security and comfort. And they left all of this, not by their own accord or by their own will, but they left all of it because God allowed a punishment to come to his people for their compromising of what he had told them to do. They're brought to a new knowledge. Here it tells them that they were trying to train them up in all the wisdom of their land. They wanted them to be given all the instruction and given knowledge, given wisdom, knowledge, and perception. so that they would be capable of being in the king's palace. And what this means is they wanted him, as we'll see later in the story, they wanted these men to be picked out from the best of all these men being trained up to be able to advise the king. This isn't just a training process for someone to go and give him wine and food when he asks for it, or to sweep the floor when he walks across it. These are men being trained up to give him advice and counsel when he needs it. But they're being brought from a place where Hebrew is the language, where God's scriptures are supposed to dictate how they live, and they're being brought to a place where they're no doubt being taught a new language. They're being taught new perspectives. They're being taught how Babylonians think about things. They're going from Jewish wisdom to the wisdom of the Babylonians. Fresh perspectives are not always bad. Sometimes a fresh perspective helps us understand God more, or understand the people we're supposed to love and serve better. But fresh perspectives can be bad if those perspectives seek to indoctrinate us in a way that we would turn our backs on God. The world itself, even today, seeks to influence through education. No doubt they were educating them on the things that they should not accept. No doubt the Babylonian education was teaching them things that will go against what God has established. It's only a very modern thing that our educational systems have tried to be completely devoid of faith and religion. Back then, no doubt their education included learning how to serve their gods better. So here we have these young, strapping, impressionable men. They've been plucked out from their home, brought to a foreign place, something that's uncomfortable for them. They're being given new knowledge and new perspectives that they've never been told before, no doubt going against the things that they should do. And then the king says, I'm going to give them a new diet. They're going to eat something new. They're going to eat from my bounty. This is a group of men who are coming from the land flowing with milk and honey, the land of promise that God had given to his people, to a land that was definitely flowing with things they shouldn't eat. It says that they gave him the king's portion and from the royal food and wine. Now, if you've been in our denomination long enough or been in this movement long enough, you know that this becomes somewhat of a pretext or a proof text for kosher eating. And I'm not saying it can't be. But sometimes when we take things out of the Bible and we make them a proof text for some doctrine we're trying to force on other people, we actually lose sight of the depth of what the Scripture is really trying to tell us. And here's the question. What is this portion that he's giving to them? Were they being provided food that was not kosher? Probably so. This is a land just like ours where kosher is not a thing that's widespread. This is a land where no doubt they would eat things that they thought tasted good and eat a lot of it if they were wealthy. But what about the wine? Because the text doesn't just say us they brought the king's portion of food and that's the issue, but there's wine there too. And wines come from grapes. Grapes are kosher by nature. Right? So is this an issue of kosher? Daniel, later on in chapter 10, he's actually going to eat meat. Is this a kosher issue? Were they being provided food that was offered to idols? This is something that gets brought up even in our New Testament. Paul has to address this in 1 Corinthians to those in Corinth. In contrast to those in Corinth and Babylon, only the king had access to food that was sacrificed to idols. We get to 1 Corinthians and the debate that happens with believers there and Paul as they're trying to argue that they should be able to partake of the big banquet halls because they were open for everyone. You wanted to eat the most lavish food in the world? Come and dine in the halls of pagan temples. Not so much in Babylon. The food for idols was relegated simply to the priest and the king only. So was the king offering them a portion of his offerings that were given to the idols. That would bring the wine into play, right? Because even in Israel, we know that wine is offered as a drink offering to Yahweh, and this obviously was the case in other nations as well. Was he offering them to partake of food that was sacrificed to idols? Was this food given in a place where idols were offered? Is it possible that the king himself invited these young men to a place where no one else could go, in the temples of their idols? In Babylon, it wasn't so much like Israel, where Israelites can come and worship the deities. It was a place where the temples were worshipped only by the priest and the king himself. Or more deeply, was this a sign of a covenant with the king himself? Something that I know that most of y'all have heard me speak on before, that we treat meals as if they are sometimes a nuisance to our daily life. We have fast food restaurants where we can drive through the drive-through window, grab a burger, and eat it in the car. Ask my family, it's like a pet peeve of mine. I cannot eat in the car. It's disgusting. It's not fitting. I'm sorry if you do it. Well, we all have to at times, but that's not what was intended. God intended us to sit down across from people. The table was intended to be a meeting place for people to have fellowship, communion, and most important, covenant with each other. Salt today is something that we just simply call a seasoning for food. It's something that allows us in our flesh to either like it or not. If it doesn't have enough salt, we don't like it. It needs more. If it has too much salt, we don't like it. We can't eat it now because you can't take away salt from a meal. Salt in the ancient world was so important. It was a sign of a covenant that if me and Nathan sat down with a meal and I set salt on the table, that meant that I wanted to have a covenant with him, that I wanted to share my life with him. Salt covenants were in the ancient world everywhere, not just Israel. There was this allegiance that was happening through food. If I invite Nathan into my home especially, and I invite his family to sit down, and I give him a meal, he not only has a salt covenant now, he has a threshold covenant. I brought him into my home. I'm duly responsible for his life of him and his family. And since I offered him salt, I'm responsible for his life forevermore. We're now in covenant. Meals were a sign of peace. Can you really sit down with your enemy and have a meal? Who would enjoy a meal sitting across from their enemies? This is why in the Psalms we have the scripture that God will place a banquet table for us in the midst of our enemies. What's he trying to say? That we can rub in this feast banquet in the face of our enemies, see what we got? Nana boo boo? No. He's saying, I'll give you peace even when others don't want you to have it. Meals were a sign of peace. So is it possible that the king was offering them not just food from his portions, not just food from idols, not just a place of having a banquet where no one else got to go? Is it possible that the king is extending this food as a sign of allegiance to him, a sign of covenant with him? That if you sat at the king's table and you partake of his food, now you're in covenant with him, and peace is only secured through him. I would suggest that maybe it's possible, because the text isn't very clear, that all of these things are part of the issue and their struggle. After this, they're given new names. They're given names, they come from a place. And if you have a lot of English names today, give glory to God because they come from Hebrew. Matthew, Nathan, I'm not sure about Laman. I'm sorry, I'm picking on Laman too much today. Daniel, his name gives glory for God. It means God is my judge. You can hear the word El in there. Hananiah, Yahweh has been gracious. Would everybody say that God is our true judge? Would everybody say that Yahweh has been gracious to us? How about Mishael? His name means who is what God is. That's a little rough translation, but essentially it's asking who is equal to God. Would everybody here attest to the fact that no one is equal to our God? I hope so. How about Azariah? Yahweh has helped. Has Yahweh helped anybody in here? Absolutely. Then their names are changed when they go to this pagan land, and Daniel's given the name Belteshazzar. Bel, the god of one of the gods of Babylon. It says Bel guard his life. Anyone here hoping that Bel will guard your life? No. Shadrach, probably an alteration of the god Marduk. Anyone giving reverence to Marduk or Aku from Mishael? How about Azariah, who's given the name Abednego? Anyone here want to be a servant of Nabu? So what's he doing here with these names? This is a total indoctrination attempt by the king to take these people from a foreign land and make them completely allegiant to him and his nation. He's taken them from the place of comfort, from the place where they know everything around them, taking them from the place where their God rules. He's given them new education that will definitely teach them new perspectives. He's given them new food that they shouldn't offer, a food that I would suggest is asking them to give allegiance to the king, and then giving them new names so that they will forget their complete identity as they live a life being referred to as something that gives honor to their nation, their king, and their gods. But does it work? That's the question. Verses 8 through 10, we'll read those. It says, Daniel determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine he drank. So he asked permission from the palace master to not defile himself. And God granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the palace master. Yet he said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and drink. What if he sees your faces looking thinner than the other young men your age? You would endanger my life with the king. Daniel here is determined to obey Yahweh. He recognizes that God is in control. And if we're not so sure at the beginning, when it says that God, Adonai, gave over the people, the things from his house and all of this to Babylon, here God is in control again. Even in the midst of Babylon, a place where it could seem as if God was non-existent, a place where it could seem in the midst of their struggles like God is not there. Anyone ever been there before? Nobody? Just me. Okay. I'm the only one who's been to a place where it seems like God is not hearing my prayers, not answering my call, not acting within my life. In the midst of that, God gives them grace and compassion. And here's a connection to the beginning of the chapter, because here's an interesting fact about Daniel. The name Yahweh is nowhere mentioned in the entire book. The name Yahweh is never spoken. And the name Adonai, the title Adonai, my Lord, is only spoken twice. Once in chapter 1 and later on in chapter 9. And here, Adonai is given it says that in the beginning Adonai was in control. And then here towards the end, after God delivers his people to Babylon, after he gives compassion to Daniel and his friends, the chief master of the palace says, I fear Adonai the king. It's Adonai, but it's not in reference to Yahweh. It's Adonai, but it's in reference to Nebuchadnezzar. And if we're not sure yet, the entire focus of the first 6 chapters of Daniel are this battle of allegiance between Yahweh and Nebuchadnezzar. Between Yahweh, the king of the universe, and Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the system or the nation or the kingdom of the beast that seeks to overrule God's rule over his creation. It's a face-off between Yahweh and Nebuchadnezzar from here throughout. And we're not going to go through the rest of the stories, but just think about it. What goes on from this chapter forward? We have the stories of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, those pagan names that I this week offered not to say again when I refer to them. We have them in the fire, in the midst of the fire. The king wants to destroy them, but Yahweh delivers them. Later on, Daniel himself will find himself in the lion's den, but again, Yahweh comes through. And the palace master, he says, I fear Adonai the king. I fear my Lord the king, because what if he sees your faces and they're looking thinner? It's kind of a funny statement. Some of us would like our faces to look a little thinner, right? But there's also another meaning that can be said here. What if he sees your faces looking angry? And the translators always have a choice of which one to use, thinner or angry. Thinner seems to fit because they're not eating as much or they're not eating the same diet. But anybody ever heard the term hangry? There's a little double entendre in that usage of the word hangry, right? Because it's saying that when you're hungry, you become angry. Anybody ever been hangry before? I see a lot of women shaking their head and looking to their spouse next to them. I'm one of those. What if it means the same? What if he's saying, if I allow you to eat this diet, not only will you become leaner, but it will be a show of contempt towards the king? What if he's concerned that them not taking part of this food is a true denial of allegiance to the king and it's contempt towards him? I would suggest that as we go forward in verses 11 through 16, that is why Daniel says not to judge their composure, not to judge their anger, not to judge what they look like in their face, but to judge their appearance alone. He says in verses 11 through 16, so Daniel said to the guard when the chief master of the palace had assigned to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then examine our appearance and the appearance of the young men who are eating the king's food, and deal with your servant based on what you see. He agreed with them about this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked better and healthier than all the young men who were eating the king's food. So the guard continued to remove their food and the wine, and they were to drink water and eat their vegetables. Someone the other day when I was going over this passage said, why 10 days? Why is it that in 10 days that was the test? If I'm trying to show something, me personally, that I'm trying to show that what I'm doing will give me a better hand above my fellow men in stature and strength, 10 days ain't the choice of time that I'm going to choose. But think about it here. I saw a video the other day that said, stop eating sugar for 10 days. I know they're not eating sugar here, but maybe they were. They were at least, stop eating sugar for 10 days. And what's the first thing that changes on your body? Anybody know? Your face. Your face will start to become slender immediately. So 10 days is generally about the time that it takes truly for your body to change. But verse 17 through 20, God says, God gave these 4 young men knowledge and understanding of every kind of literature and wisdom. Daniel also understood visions and dreams of every kind. At the end of that time that the king had said to present them, the palace master presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king interviewed them. I'm going to verse 20. And among all of them, no one was found to be equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they began to attend the king. And every matter of wisdom and understanding that the king consulted them about, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and the mediums in the entire kingdom. Again, what does it say? It doesn't say that they were able to, because of their stature and because they stood firm, that they were able to learn more of the things that Babylon was trying to tell them. It doesn't say that they were able to excel in their studies because they had better cognizance through their diet or anything like that. It says God granted them wisdom. It was God who made them mighty. It was God who made them 10 times the men and the magicians and the mediums that were around them. And where have we seen this before? Does this story sound familiar to anyone? How about the story of Joseph? How about we have another story of where a man's in captivity, where he's given a place of honor through trust in Yahweh, where he gives interpretations of dreams to the rulers of the land, and that allows him the second in command to the king. And eventually that person is outcast at the end of the story. These people, these young men, I have to believe that Daniel and his friends knew the story of Joseph, knew the story of God's promise to Abraham, knew the story of God's deliverance of his people before, and trusted that if they would stand firm, that they would have the same deliverance in the end. They had faith in the God who worked in Joseph. They had faith in the God who worked in Moses, another similar story. They had faith in the God who made a promise to Abraham that he had yet to fulfill. And in verse 21, the last verse of the chapter, it says, Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Now, if we're familiar with our history and our understanding of the exile, that means he remained there until the end of the exile, which was how many years? 70. He didn't just remain in Babylon for 70 years. Daniel remained at the second in charge, the one who would advise the king for 70 years until Cyrus comes to deliver the people of Israel back to Judea. He was there for 70 years. Think about this. When he goes to the lion's den at the end of his journey, he's like 90 years old. 90. And I have struggles of faith just talking to someone about the gospel today. This man was 90 years old and willing to go into the lion's den because of his faith. He didn't have a moment of no compromise. We can all have moments of not compromising. We can all have moments where we're proud and we look back and say, I stood up for God at that moment. I didn't compromise to what the world wanted me to do. But is that what God calls us to do? To have moments of compromise? He lived a life of no compromise. He lived a life of dedicating himself to God. And how do we know this? Because God allowed him to remain in the place he was because of a journey that started with no compromise. He wasn't fearful of the world around him. He didn't fear the new and unfamiliar place that God had sent him to. He didn't fear the government that was in control of the place that he lived. He didn't fear the educational system that sought to indoctrinate him. He didn't fear the names that people were calling him. He lived at the same time as Jeremiah 29. I thought about this morning. Jeremiah 29 is not an instruction or a letter written to Daniel per se, but it's written to the same people living in the same exile in Babylon. And there was a prophet who had come and said, don't worry, just 2 years from now, God will bring you back to the land. And Jeremiah says, don't believe the false prophet. Plant your gardens. Get married. Have children and grandchildren. Multiply in the midst of the land that God has brought you to, and seek the peace of the world around you. God has a role for everybody, both low and high. He had a role for Daniel that was dependent upon him not compromising his faith and allegiance to God, but also he had a role for every single person that was brought to Babylon to not compromise either. Nowhere in the instructions of Jeremiah 29 does it say, go and worship other gods that you've been brought to the land of. Nowhere does it say, forget that Yahweh was your deliverer at one time and will deliver you again. It says, be a light of peace in a nation of darkness. Be an uncompromising, unwavering light of peace in the dark place that I've brought you to. There was this story that I came upon this week reading about compromise. I came across a story of this redwood tree. I don't know if it's true or not, but this tree was 400 years old, redwoods in California. It survived storms, lightning, earthquakes, all the things that you can imagine for 400 years in California. It even survived the liberal politics of the state that would probably want to chop it down. I'm joking. I'm not trying to get political. But it fell over. And so here was a tree that stood for 400 years. And what caused it to fall over? They went and looked. Beetles. Beetles found their way inside the trunk and deteriorated it from the inside out and destroyed it, and it fell over. And this is really the instruction that Yahweh has for us today. I know about a couple months ago I said Yahweh wants us to be like goldfish. I don't know if y'all remember that. He wants us to be like beetles. He tells us not to rise up with weapons and destroy the world around us, but to subvert the kingdom of the beast with the uncompromising gospel and love of Christ. Daniel and the exiles waited 70 years for God's promise to come to fruition. Most of them, no doubt, never saw that promise fulfilled. Most of them never saw the return to the nation of Israel. Daniel was 80 years, and it says that he died in the first year of King Cyrus's reign, but it doesn't even tell us that he made it back to the land. Even Daniel, who lived that long. What are the things today that seek to distract us from our purpose in God? Movies? TV? I know that if I set my kids in front of a TV for too long, especially watching the wrong thing, their attitude changes immediately. Immediately. Anybody else? Or just my kids? Yeah. How about music? I love music. I love all kinds of music. And for some reason, we think that the music of our parents or grandparents was not as bad as the music we have today. And then you go listen to it, and you're reminding yourself that it's just as bad, even if it sounds old. Melissa always reminds me, she makes those small decisions, right? That we can't have that kind of music, because there was an old thing on the radio years ago on the Hill radio station that said, garbage in, garbage out. Don't put the garbage in. What about our educational system? Does our education seek to distract us from our purpose in God? Did it distract Daniel, though? Were they able to live in the midst of an education system that wanted to distract them but didn't? There was a place I was speaking at in 2021, and I heard a speaker say, if you allow your children to go to public school, you're handing them over to the devil and indoctrinating them with Satan's education. And it was really sad, because there were a lot of people in that crowd who had children in public school education. Is it the public school education that is the issue? Or should we be raising up Daniels that are able to stand firm and not compromise in the midst of an education that wants to indoctrinate us? That's not a pro or a con against educational systems or homeschool. We've done both. What about the government? You ever sit back and think, is the government trying to take us away from our purpose in God? How many people has the government distracted over the past 10 years with politics? Trump, Biden, all a big distraction, trying to get you not focused on the message and the purpose that God has for you. Does God tell us, love those who are only Republicans? Does he tell us to love only those who are liberals or Democrats? No. The scripture tells us to love all men. Not even just men who believe like us, but all men, mankind. We're to love every single person, but politics would have you think that you have to hate a person who doesn't align with your political views. It's a distraction. Social media. Social media a distraction to anybody? So many people going back and forth. I'm leaving social media, but then they come right back. It consumes their days. What about work itself? Anybody's job detract you from the purpose that God has for you? All of these things. But here's the bigger question. Can we live in the midst of all of these distractions and be uncompromising images of God and bearers of an uncompromising gospel? That's the question. All of these things seek to destroy us and our faith in God, but will we stand firm like Daniel? Can we seek the welfare of the city around us regardless of what the city wants to do to us? Can we consider ourselves blessed when other people call us names that aren't our own? Anybody ever been called a name as a child? Absolutely. What about as an adult? Anybody ever been called a derogatory name because of your faith or your steadfastness and obedience to God? And what is usually our response? I'll tell you what my response is. I want to get out and defend myself, tell them how they shouldn't call me that, and how God is the person that we're supposed to follow, and if they don't like it, they can kick rocks. But what does Jesus say? When others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account, rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. So they persecuted the prophets who were before you. I would encourage you to go read that again. It's Matthew chapter 5, because he doesn't say, blessed are those who, when others revile you and persecute you, that you argue back and tell them they're wrong. Some can't do some of these things, and they know their limits. I think this is good for a time, but it's also a good wake-up call to say, what can I work on? How can I come to God better? How can I strengthen my faith in God so that these things around me won't distract me from the purpose that he has for me? Are we preparing ourselves and our children to be Daniels? Again, Daniel was a teenager. If Daniel was living today, this would be a perfect nation that would seek to send him to a public school and send him to a public university, that he would have social media all around him and friends would seek to influence him. He'd probably want to go to the same colleges, be a part of the same fraternity and all of these things. But Daniel stood firm. Are we raising children and raising teenagers who will stand firm and uncompromised even if they're in the same situations? Sometimes, and I've seen this come to fruition, sometimes when we shield our children too much, they're not prepared for the time that God may send them to Babylon. Sometimes they're not prepared to go out and be a light for Christ because they don't know how to keep the bushel from covering it. Romans 12 is a great verse that tells us what I think is the heart of Daniel, that says, therefore, brothers and sisters, in view of the mercies of God, I urge you, present your bodies as living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is true worship. Do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God. You know what's interesting about the gospel is that for all of the scriptures leading up to the New Testament, everything seemed to be focused on one place and one people and one location. And in my opinion, the people misunderstood the call and the promise to Abraham. But when Yeshua enters the scene, when he takes his place on the cross and he's resurrected and he goes to his disciples, he doesn't tell them to sit here and make sure that Israel gets their act straight. God's will and purpose was that all of his people would go into the Babylons. All of his people would go into the Assyrians. Because if they don't do so, then the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Americans and the Canadians and the Iranians and the Iraqians, they can't know who God is if they don't see God exemplified through people who won't compromise. Here's the thing. I got some letters of recommendation from some professors lately, and the best comment I think I had in all of them was that one of them said that I was uncompromising in my faith. Now, I don't think that's always true. But if I could think of one compliment for me, that I hope that's the one that people see. Because whether you're a believer or not, the world depends on people who won't compromise. Even in the military. Even in walks of life that you think God is not interacting in, people are looking for people who won't compromise. Why? Because we can't trust people who do. You can't trust someone with God's mission who is willing to compromise. Did Daniel ever sin? Of course. Of course Daniel sinned, but I would have to think that Daniel would lean on the wisdom that we find in 1 John 1:9 that said, God is easy to forgive and quick to forgive, but we cannot remain in our sin. 2 Timothy 2:20-21 says, now in a large house there are not only gold and silver vessels, but also those of wood and clay, some for honorable use and some for dishonorable use. We're not going to talk about the places in our house that are for dishonorable use. So if anyone purifies himself from anything dishonorable, He will be a special instrument set apart, useful to the master, prepared for every good work. If anyone purifies himself from anything dishonorable. There's so many people out there who say that they want to serve God, they want to do God's mission, that they want to do great things for God, but they're unwilling to not compromise. They're unwilling to cleanse themselves from everything dishonorable. And we end up in such a mess where the world doesn't trust the church because we are not men and women of no compromise. I'm saddened, even in our denomination, our movement lately, that there's so many people who are willing to compromise and unwilling to call out those who do. There's so many people. There's one of the most famous preachers, just right down I-20, I think he's in the Dallas area, who compromised his faith, his marriage, and his dedication to God and his dedication to his church by having inappropriate conversations with another woman, and they were unwilling to hold him properly accountable, and he was back in the pulpit 3 months later. We have to be people of no compromise, and we have to be people who hold others accountable who aren't. I was sharing with someone recently the story of me and Nathan, and I know that some of you have heard this story before. My faith in God was at the tail end, or my coming to salvation was at the tail end of about a decade of prayer and unwillingness to compromise from Nathan and his family. Chiefly Nathan and Jamin, and I know others were praying. Both of those men, especially Nathan, saw my worldly ways, and if I'm completely honest, I tempted Nathan many times with joining me in my escapades, and he was unwilling to compromise. There was one time where he almost did. I'm not going to go into detail. But he stopped and he said, I can't do this. He essentially said, I'm unwilling to compromise. This is part of my journey, a huge part of my coming to faith in God and coming to serve Him eventually. And if I can have one chief pride in my faith in my life, is that I've been a vessel that God has used to impact thousands of people. And if Nathan was not willing to be uncompromising, what kind of impact would that have? Just one person that nature impacted has gone on to impact thousands of people. And that's just through one person. Whatever happened to the palace master? I wish I knew. Because the palace master watched these 4 men be uncompromising and watched God work in their lives to do the things that they thought that He would do. I wish I knew what happened to the palace master. There are people out there whose salvation depends on your unwavering allegiance to Christ and your unwillingness to compromise your walk in Him and with Him. If I could leave you with anything, it's just with that. That Daniel is an example, sure, of eating kosher, okay. Daniel is more an example of not wavering your allegiance to God in the face of immense pressure of new places. Who knows where God will send you tomorrow? Who knows where God will send you next week? God may send you across this world in an instant. He may put you in a place where they want to indoctrinate you, get you to do things that God has told you not to do. Call you names, change your identity, seek to make you a whole new person. Will you stand firm and uncompromising so that others will come to know Christ? They're going to start the music here now. We're going to pray. And afterwards, if you need prayer, if you need to be built up by prayer, that's what we're here for. We're here to build you up so that you will go forth this week and be that uncompromising light for others. That people will see your actions and want to say, I want to know who your God is. I want to have the relationship with God that you have. I want a relationship that never compromises. If you need prayer to be built up for that, come forward. Me and Nathan will be down here Layman's in the back. Will will be to the side. Shannon can pray with you. Come forward and be prayed over. But go forth this week. Go read the stories of Daniel. This is just the beginning. Read chapters 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, where that unwavering faith and unwillingness to compromise were put to the test. And let it be an encouragement for you. Father, we come before you today. We thank you for the overwhelming freedom that you've given us to come together to worship you, to be in fellowship and give you all the glory, that we would be built up in your word and through study this afternoon, that people on the south side of Monroe will come to faith in you because of the unwillingness to compromise of people in this church and in this community. I pray that you will give us the strength to go forward, and in the midst of a world that wants to turn us to the kingdom of the beast and away from the kingdom of Yahweh, that you will give us firm like Daniel did. Give us strength to stand firm so that others will see that only a relationship with you is one that can be completely and wholly uncompromising, because your promise and your reward is to be given to us beyond this physical life. Let us place our faith truly and wholly in you, and let us not compromise in the midst of those things that want to cause us to. I pray that you give health to those in our community and that you give safety for those who are traveling. And we thank you for all the bounty that you've given us through the food that we'll have, the table fellowship. But Lord, let us understand that the fellowship we have every single week is intended to build bonds and intended to build relationships. But most importantly, they're